Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. It's been wonderful thus far. I had a little time in the Barossa and a little time in Adelaide up and down the river, and it's been spectacular. And the Australian folks here are just so friendly. So thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about metabolic flexibility. In the first half, I'll make some definitions. I'll show you a little bit of what we mean when we talk about metabolic flexibility. In the second half, I'll show you kind of a portfolio of clinical studies that we've done that suggest that metabolic flexibility is actually necessary for normal thermogenesis, the combustion of fuels as well. If you are ever in Orlando, come by and see us. I know many people come to see Mickey Mouse and Harry Potter and all of that, but Florida's nice when it's cool here. You can come over and be warm, and or vice versa, one of the other here. I do work in drug discovery and development, so I'll put my disclosures up here with companies that I work with, and I will show some pharmacologic data, even though most of the work that I'm going to show is related to dietary influences on metabolic flexibility. So we've known for a very long time, mostly from studies related to the biology of glucose and fat oxidation, that you have this, as we would say in the US, a seesaw effect between glucose and fat oxidation. I like to think of protein oxidation as being relatively fixed throughout the day. We make that assumption, but actually there's not much data on protein oxidation throughout the 24-hour circadian rhythm. But this glucose and fat coordinately regulated system is one that's incredibly complex, both in terms of dietary, hormonal, circadian, and actually other systems that we're beginning to explore related to nutrient sensing within the cell that can shift between glucose and fat oxidation. Put another way, this is a nice slide from a review paper a couple of years ago that shows that if you look at RQ, which is respiratory quotient, which I'll define here in just a few minutes, that particularly after a meal you see an increase in carbohydrate oxidation, a reduction in fat oxidation, and then this return back again to fat oxidation here. And this inflexibility is an abnormal state that we see in obesity, type 2 diabetes, and in other metabolic disorders like NASH, etc. And so we talk about inflexibility, or a flat pattern with meals and circadian variation, or flexibility, which is the healthy and young pattern. This term was actually coined by David Kelly and Larry Mandarino back in the late 90s and summarized nicely in this paper in Diabetes in 2000. And they were doing limb balance studies where they measured directly with the Fick method across arterial venous differences for CO2 and oxygen to be able to measure substrate oxidation. And on the left-hand panel here, you see that during the fasting state in lean individuals, you have this increase in carbohydrate oxidation with insulin stimulation, simulating a meal. But in obese patients, they had essentially no change in substrate selection between glucose and fat. Now, I like to call this a dual defect. People tend to focus either on the beginning, which is the impairment in fat oxidation in the obese state, or at the end of insulin stimulation, where there's this inability to turn on carbohydrate oxidation with insulin. But it's a dual defect. You most often see both defects simultaneously. Looked at the same data looked at a different way. The green here really is the lipid oxidation, which gets turned off in the lean subject, but again, in the obese subject, they're flat or fixed. And that inflexibility, we believe, is in part due to adipose tissue. And at my keynote talk tomorrow morning, I'll talk a little bit more about the adipose tissue contributions here. But again, the key point is that there's this dual defect, decreased insulin sensitivity for turning on glucose disposal and oxidation, as well as storage as glycogen, and also this baseline decrease in fatty acid oxidation. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about today the different organs that are involved. Suffice it to say that this is a complicated control system that includes multiple organs, hormones, neural inputs, and actually nutrient inputs as well. Now, looking back kind of into the Stone Ages here, this is late 90s sort of work, which I think is still relevant today. This baseline defect in fat oxidation actually is related to weight gain and the ability to lose weight over time. And we continue to work in this area, although it's not terribly sexy or popular to work on this problem right now, but I think it's incredibly important. And so we continue to spend time on this. And generally speaking, there are relationships between the ability to oxidize fat in the post-absorptive overnight state and the ability to either lose weight or to predict weight gain. And we'll go into that just a little bit more in a few minutes. But the other area, which I think is also very interesting, is its relationship to diabetes. And fuel input into different tissues, by and large, will determine what the fuels oxidize independent of what the hormonal state, particularly with insulin, is. And so this is a very interesting series of clinical studies that were done by Ralph DeFranzo and Mandeep Bajaj when he was in San Antonio. The references are here. And they used a drug called Acipammox, which blocks lipolysis. Now, you can't use that forever because you get escape from the block of lipolysis. But they showed very nicely that over 1 week, this is pretty phenomenal, over 1 week, changing plasma free fatty acids almost by half. They improve insulin-stimulated suppression of free fatty acids. I'll talk about that in a minute, how insulin suppresses lipolysis and drops free fatty acids. And they lowered fasting plasma glucose in patients with diabetes and improved insulin sensitivity quite substantially, muscle by 20%, and basically completely reversed the defects in hepatic insulin sensitivity as well. So one of the major inputs into what the body does in terms of insulin sensitivity is the prevailing free fatty acids that predominantly come from adipose tissue, but also from VLDL triglycerides produced by the liver. Let me take just a minute and go through one of the technologies or methodologies that we use to measure this metabolic flexibility. Remember I said that David Kelly and Larry Mandarino did arterial venous cannulation and measured AV differences in the leg. That's a fairly invasive procedure, quite complicated to do, and you can't really study very many patients with this. So we use an alternative methodology called the euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp. And I'll show you how this works here because it will depend upon how you think about the data I'm going to show you. But basically, we infuse insulin into a vein, we measure the glucose, and then we seek to keep the plasma glucose levels steady and euglycemic, while the insulin has its effect to reduce plasma glucose. And then as needed, we turn on the glucose pump so that we can maintain glucose in as glucose is being disposed of. Now at the same time, we use indirect calorimetry, basically measuring the consumption of oxygen and the production of CO2. And again, this is the respiratory quotient, which is the volume of oxygen over the volume of CO2 over time. And you can get the quick. There we go. Let me back up one. It's not clicking here. Quick's right there. So basically what we do at the beginning is do stepwise increases in the insulin infusion. And then again, because glucose is disposed of, we have to turn on glucose so that we maintain glucose homeostasis artificially, as it were. And then over time, we can measure this respiratory quotient, fatty acid oxidation being a low RQ and a high RQ being carbohydrate oxidation. And we define then the difference between baseline and the maximal RQ as the delta RQ, which is one measure of metabolic flexibility. Okay, so what are the clinical determinants of metabolic flexibility? This is a study that Lauren Sparks and I did several years ago, where we looked at a large, healthy young population, almost 80 individuals, and looked at the clinical correlates. And as you can see from the top left-hand side here, that body fatness is associated with inflexibility. Leanness is associated with flexibility. The size of the fat cell, which I'll again talk about tomorrow, big fat cells are associated with being inflexible. At the hormone adiponectin that comes from adipose tissue is associated with flexibility. It's a good adipocyte hormone. Fasting free fatty acids, not much here, but importantly, the ability to suppress free fatty acids after a euglycemic clamp is really important here. We'll come back to that in just a second. I also want to talk about another study that we did years ago looking at metabolic flexibility, and this is a drug that is occasionally now used to treat type 2 diabetes. And these are patients with type 2 diabetes who were treated with this drug called pioglitazone. Their ability to store glucose measured as a euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp for glucose disposal actually went up when we treated them. The ability to suppress free fatty acids is shown here in the right-hand panel with insulin, so their fat cells become more insulin sensitive to turn off free fatty acid release. And we see that during the clamp and also in other measures that we did here as well, both at low and high insulin doses. Again, suggesting that part of the way that many drugs work to improve insulin sensitivity is to make the fat cell happy so that it can suppress fatty acids and allow glucose oxidation to turn on appropriately. Okay, so in the last couple of 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about this concept of metabolic flexibility and how that might relate to energy expenditure. This is a relatively new idea that we've been working on in the laboratory, but I want to show you a couple of vignettes, both with nutritional interventions, but also with pharmacologic interventions that are beginning to coalesce into this idea that there is this link between the ability to turn on fat burning, particularly at nighttime, and the ability to have an active thermogenic system turned on as well. So the first study, and this is unpublished, was driven by our desire to understand in detail the metabolomic and other responses in skeletal muscle to oversupply of lipid. But we knew from the literature that there were a couple of other studies published that showed that increasing free fatty acids in the blood by just giving an infusion of lipid would turn on both fat oxidation and thermogenesis. And we scratched our head a little bit and said, what's that all about? And replicated this study, which we called the Magellan study. We like explorers. There are lots of explorers you can choose, but we just called this one the Magellan study. Let me walk you through what we did. We were interested in understanding how individuals could start from a lot of glucose carbohydrate burning from a nutritional standpoint, and then their ability to switch on fat burning under different conditions. So what we did was feed otherwise healthy young folks a high carb diet for 3 days. We gave them a high carb meal the night before. We gave them a high carb snack. And then we started an IV overnight. And the basic study design was we had 3 groups. We had obese patients who were inflexible. Okay, remember they get stuck on a particular ability to burn fat versus glucose. And they had no actual treatment other than the lipid infusion, which I'll show you in a minute. We had 2 groups of lean subjects in a parallel arm randomized and blinded treatment where we either gave them glucose overnight, just really recapitulated the setting of lots of dietary glucose, or we gave them saline, which would allow them to actually turn on fat burning overnight. We then measured blood and metabolic rate throughout the course of the day, and then at about noontime we gave them a milkshake in the vein. And it really does look like a milkshake. Has anybody ever seen intralipid used in the hospitals? Yeah, it's a milkshake. It's a vanilla milkshake in the vein. And it's used commonly in hospitals for hyperalimentation or nutrient replacement. And then we also measured some blood and measured their ability to turn on fat burning. So oftentimes people with these metabolic studies believe you have to give heparin to release lipoprotein lipase, which can then take the triglyceride and break it down into free fatty acids. You don't have to do that. You can do this without heparin. And heparin's a problem if you're going to do biopsies or other kinds of sampling. So you can actually achieve increases in circulating free fatty acids without using heparin. So here is the group that was given glucose overnight. So again, you suppress their free fatty acids and lipolysis from the fat cell. If you look at the lean or the obese subjects that were given saline, they're higher. These are pretty standard free fatty acid concentrations. And you put the milkshake in, they break down the triglyceride, and you get free fatty acids that increase. So this is a little detailed, so I'll spend a few minutes on it. This is the fat oxidation measured by indirect calorimetry. The individuals who were free living on an ad lib diet actually decreased when you put them on this high carb diet, their fat oxidation just a little bit. But then when you give them the milkshake or the interlipid, they turn on their fat burning. The individuals who were on an ad lib diet and we gave glucose to overnight, they really turned off their fat oxidation, but they could still turn on their fat oxidation when they were given excess substrate. The obese subjects, actually, this was really, we didn't quite understand this. We gave them a high carb diet and they actually turned on more of their fat oxidation there, which we don't still to this day completely understand. But you give them interlipid in the vein and they can also turn on their fat oxidation. On the right-hand panel, we show the beta-hydroxybutyrate as one of many lipidomic and metabolomic markers we measured in the plasma, and appropriately, probably the liver, but also maybe other tissues, turns on ketogenesis as well. Now here's where it gets interesting. These are the individuals, the subjects that were lean and given saline. Their energy expenditure measured again by calorimetry and normalized to their baseline levels really didn't change much throughout the course of the morning. But when you give them interlipid, they turn on calorie burning. And that's about 15% just by switching substrate from glucose to fatty acid. And if you look at the ones that had glucose overnight, their energy expenditure actually drifted down. And we've seen this in another study as well, where giving people glucose actually decreases energy expenditure. And all of our equations, by the way, take into account the stoichiometry of whether one is burning carbohydrate versus fat in terms of the measurement of energy expenditure. And interestingly, we didn't think about doing this in advance, but the ones that were given interlipids took the covers off. Because it's cool in the unit in the morning, and they cover up with the blanket, and you give them interlipid, and they start throwing the covers off. And I wish we had documented that. We do have some data on core temperature that suggests that it goes up a little bit as well. If you look at the ones who came in as obese and were given saline, they had about a 12% increase. If you look at the ones that were given glucose overnight, this is a little bit more than 15. It's about 17%, I recall. So we have this, and this was all blinded, by the way. So we put bags over all the infusion sets, so they didn't know when they were getting the milkshake. Okay. So, and I'll show you some other data, and there's a couple of other published studies suggesting the same thing. So let's just say our hypothesis was supported that fat burning turns on the thermogenic pathway, and we could talk about mechanisms maybe in a little bit. We went back into the archives of old studies because, you do this business for a while and you get stuff that piles up and you scratch your head and don't completely understand it. Let me walk you through a clinical study where we actually, instead of giving people fat in the vein, we gave them fat in the spoon, in the fork. We fed them fat. So this was a study I did way back in the early of my career, probably 20 plus years ago now, where we took individuals, put them in the metabolic ward, fed them a fixed diet, eucaloric. We didn't overfeed them. We put them in a room calorimeter, and then we fed them about a 50% fat diet, and we just measured their calorie burning. And as it turns out, this metabolic flexibility study, that's why this study was done, you turn down a carbohydrate burning and lower the RQ, this is the RQ over here, and over about 3 days your body adapts and begins to burn those extra fat calories and begins to conserve glucose. Now, they don't quite get there. This would be the level of the RQ change you would expect based upon the composition of the diet, but we and others have shown out, 5-6 days later, people do come into equilibrium. These are the individual days data, and you look at this and you go, what a hornet's nest is this? But this is very high quality metabolic hoard data, and as it turns out, this variability is really important and interesting. And this is their fitness right here, how many moles of oxygen they can consume per kilo of body weight over time, just standard fitness. And those who were able to burn fat have lower fat balance, and those who can't burn fat are up here, and it turns out being fit protects you, or actually accelerates your ability to burn fat, and that turns out to be important. So we went on and did one more study, a little bit crazy. It was a 5-way crossover. I'll only show you 4 of the arms. This is now published a couple of years ago by a postdoc who was digging through some data and decided they needed to write a paper. But Jeff Sakwegia and I did this study where we had people consume a high-fat or a low-fat diet, either under sedentary or active conditions. 3 miles an hour on a treadmill in the room calorimeter at 3% grade for 3 hours. So it's walking. It's like living in the city. And so let me just kind of cut to the chase here and walk you through the data. Here's the RQ data. So when people consume a high carbohydrate diet, they burn more carbohydrate. That's good. They consume a high fat diet, they burn more fat. That's good. And then here's sleeping energy expenditure. As it turns out, in the individuals who were fed fat, that's the black circle here, versus the black circle versus the white circle, these are the people that are walking. And when they're sleeping, they're burning more calories. Now, we were very precise in feeding them the number of calories that they burned, so they were at energy balance. They weren't overfed, they weren't underfed. So here's a setting where you give fat and people burn more fat, but they also burn more total calories at the same time. But they only do that when they're moving. If they're sedentary, couch potato, and this is actually, with their sedentary, they don't burn fat and they don't burn extra calories. And this has actually been replicated by another group in Chicago, and it's quite an interesting phenomenon that we don't, again, understand, but burning fat turns calorie burning on generally. Now, 2 quick studies I'm going to show you. One is around an insulin that actually is preferential for the liver. It's called basal insulin peglispro, or BIL for short. It has a long half-life. It's hepatoselective, and it causes weight loss in people with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. How the heck does that work? Well, our friends from Lilly came and knocked on our door and said, how the heck does that work? And we designed a study based on the characteristics of this insulin so that, and just to kind of wrap this up and put a bow on it, the regular insulin called glargine was the comparator. And with each meal, you get this bolus of insulin called rapid-acting insulin. And the adipose tissue, muscle, and the liver are exposed to insulin constantly over 24 hours. Now, the BIL insulin is actually kind of interesting because it's a long-acting insulin from a pharmacologic standpoint, but it doesn't do anything to the fat in the muscle. So the rapid-acting insulin goes up and down, and at nighttime, you have no insulin for your muscle and liver, or muscle and fat, but you have insulin action at the liver. So our hypothesis was that you would get lipolysis from the adipose tissue. You would burn that in the muscle, and the liver would have glucose control because you'd have insulin on the liver. And indeed, this was the crazy study we did. It was 20 subjects with type 1 diabetes, where we cross them over from a randomized starting point to one or the other. Diet, we put them in the calorimeter. We measured how many calories they burned at each different time of day with a very structured study. And indeed, if you look at 24-hour energy expenditure, they burned about 50 calories more for 24 hours average. But if you look at the nighttime energy expenditure, they burned an extra 90 calories. So every time we turn on fat burning, we're turning on thermogenesis to the tune of about 100 calories. And if you come to my talk either tonight for the general practitioners, I'll talk a little bit more about this. Last but not least, we put folks on a ketogenic diet. We locked them in the metabolic ward. We fed them a 70+% fat diet for 4 weeks. And what happens to energy expenditure when people overconsume fat? Well, this is a Herculean study, but we got it done with the folks at Columbia, Pennington, and at NIH in Bethesda. Here's sleeping energy expenditure, which increases 100 to 150 kcals. This tends to wane over time. But if you look at 24-hour energy expenditure, again, you're getting about 100 kcal increase in thermogenesis. So just to wrap this up, metabolic flexibility is good. Metabolic inflexibility is bad. The ability to switch on substrate oxidation towards fatty acid increases calorie burning. And we believe that, particularly from a public health strategy, that there may be ways to use dietary measures, and we're doing this in type 1 diabetes actually right now, to use dietary approaches to get the normal flexibility in substrate oxidation and to get this nocturnal, particularly nocturnal fatty acid burning that seems to waste calories. We could spend an hour talking about the mechanism for that, but I will not. I'd like to acknowledge the folks that worked on many of these studies. And if you're in the States, end of October, 1st of November, come to the Obesity Society meeting. And I'm going to go there and tell people to come here because this is a great meeting, and thank you for your attention. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there are other drugs that have been developed that are better than acipamux, some of the nicotinamide receptor agonists that also inhibit. There are multiple systems that one could use to begin to test this. I think those were in development. People were looking at them for cardiovascular disease prevention, and I don't think they looked at some of these metabolic flexibility parameters, so they're sitting on the shelf out there. I'd love to get my hands on some of the GPR mimetics for the fatty acid receptor and the niacin receptor, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. I know you just briefly said at the end you didn't want to go there, but
yes, you can come to the United States if you'd like to. We'd love to have you back.
Quick snapshot on what you think is occurring in terms of how that engine.
Yeah, that's great. We have a couple of ideas that we're working on, not actively, but conceptually, kind of cognitive experiments that we've done. The two reigning ones are the highest on the list in terms of my thinking is we know from isolated mitochondrial studies that free fatty acids uncouple, and we're not quite sure how that works. There could be a redox switch, which Mary Ellen Harper has talked about. This glutathione switch on UCP3 could be one of the ways that you can shift redox with fatty acids. That would be number two. And then Ed Mazerow, back in the 60s, and it's been rediscovered now 3 times since then, talked about substrate cycling for oxidation through to acetyl-CoA. Export vis-a-vis ATP citrate lyase from the mitochondria, where you then synthesize fatty acids and begin to run a cycle. And that's an anaplerotic process that consumes more energy than it actually produces when you oxidize that fat again. And we think that both fat and glucose are necessary for this what I call the Mazerow-Duluth cycle. but there are others who have rediscovered this. So, and that actually turns out, that's how leptin turns on thermogenesis in muscle directly too. So we think there are multiple control systems around this, this substrate cycle or wasting cycle in skeletal muscle. That would, I think that's probably the most interesting, but I would not discount just a fatty acid uncoupling or a redox switch that occurs somehow in the mitochondria. We could talk some maybe more over a pint.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.